A dishonest manager wanted to hire someone in his accounting department who thought like he did. He ended up with 3 applicants for the job, and he proceeded to interview them the next day. The first applicant came in and sat at the desk, and he and the manager engaged in some small talk. But eventually the manager asked the applicant this question: what does 2 plus 2 equal? The man was quite puzzled, but eventually answered, well, that's simple. The answer is 4. The manager thanked the man for his time and then ushered him out of the office. The next applicant came in, and again the manager engaged him in some conversation, but eventually he got around to asking him the same question. And the second man responded, well, there are several possibilities. 2 and 2 makes 4, but so does 3 and 1. Or 2.5 and 1.5, they also make 4. There are a number of ways to arrive at the same answer. The manager thought that was a pretty good reply and told him he might be getting back to him. Finally, the third applicant came in, and again, manager made some small talk about several subjects, but eventually the man was asked the same question as the others. What does 2 plus 2 equal? The man seemed startled by the question. He looked at the manager, cautiously looked around the room, got up out of his chair, and went over and closed the door. Then when he came back and leaned over across the desk and said in a low voice, tell me, what would you like the answer to be? He got the job. Our series that we started last week is called Hard Questions. And the question for this Sunday is Christianity responsible? Is it logical? Can you hang your hat on what our faith says? And the answer to that question is this: it all depends what answer you are looking for. What would you like the answer to be? You see, if Christianity offers the answer you are looking for, then it is responsible. But Paul tells us in our passage this morning that there are people out there who does not like Christianity because it does not offer the kind of answer that they want to hear. Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:23, but we proclaim Christ crucified, a stumbling block to Jews and foolishness to Gentiles. The cross is a stumbling block to many. It is foolishness to a lot of folks. In fact, there's something about the message of the cross that makes people uneasy, annoyed, upset, sometimes even downright nasty. There was a Roman historian, Tacitus, called Christianity a pernicious superstition. Freud believed that religions in general, and Christianity in particular, was a psychotic illness. And former Attorney General under Bill Clinton, Janet Reno, declared, a cultist is one who has a strong belief in the Bible and the second coming of Christ, who frequently attend Bible studies, who have a high level of financial giving to a Christian cause, who homeschools their children, who has accumulated survival food and has a strong belief in the Second Amendment, and who distrusts big government. Any of these may qualify a person as a cultist. Morning, folks. Welcome to your cult. Tacitus, Freud, and Janet Reno are just a few of those who are offended by the message of the cross. It makes them angry to think anyone would embrace what we believe. And yet, for those of us who understand what the cross means, we know that the cross of Christ is the answer to the power of God. As Paul wrote in 1 Corinthians 1:18, for the message about the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. But to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. The cross is the right answer if it is the answer you are looking for. But most of the world, that is not the answer that they're looking for. Many people only want an answer that will give them control of their lives. They want to be in charge. The Bible offends them because it declares that our lives are to be controlled by God. The cross declares that God bought you with a price. You are not your own. If you accept the answer of the cross, you cede authority in your life over to Christ. That answer does not sit well with a lot of folks. Many even reject the belief in God because they don't want someone else in control. Or they do believe in God, they don't want a God who demands change in their lives. They want a God who would change for them. They want to say how their lives should be ran. That was the problem for the Jews in Jesus' day. Paul wrote that the Jews of his day rejected the cross because Jews demand signs. They demanded signs. But didn't Jesus do miraculous things during his ministry on earth? Well, yes, he did. He healed the sick. He raised the dead. And fed thousands with just 5 loaves of bread and 2 fish. And because he did, these multitudes followed him. Wherever he went, people would crowd the hills and the seashores where he would speak, sometimes for hours on end. And then sometimes y'all complain about how long my sermons are. But thousands of Jews would follow him. That is until he was crucified. As long as Jesus was doing what they wanted him to do, they'll follow him. But once he was arrested, condemned, and crucified, they walked away. The cross was not the answer that they were looking for. A lot of people who reject Christ in their lives have done it for that same reason. God didn't answer their prayers in the way and in the time they wanted. Or something happened in their lives that hurt them terribly, and they felt betrayed because God didn't protect them from that pain. and they walked away. As long as God did what they wanted done, they were willing to follow. But this was different. He didn't protect them from suffering and hardship. That wasn't what they signed up for. That wasn't the God they wanted. They wanted a God who would protect them from the difficulties of life. They wanted a God who would protect them from the difficulties of life. But the cross defies that notion. The cross speaks of death and suffering and pain and loss. It speaks of a world that is often unfair and unjust. It speaks of a world where even God's people are often required to endure suffering and tragedy, hardship and pain. The cross declares that life won't always turn out the way you want it to. But that life will ultimately turn out the way that God wants it to. Jesus said in John 16:33, "In this world you will have trouble, but take heart, I have overcome the world." The cross declares that this world will be hard. You will have trouble, but there's something better on the other side. I have overcome the world. If you're looking for God's answer, then that's perfectly reasonable. The cross of Christ tells us the truth about life. There will be suffering. There will be pain. But if you are willing to wait on Him, Jesus will carry you through. As Psalms 23 says, "Yea, though I walk through," what was that? "The valley of the shadows of death." The cross tells you the truth about this reality. And that because it is the answer the world needs to understand. So, first, the world looks for an answer that allows them to be in control. Secondly, the world looks for an answer that allows them to be wise. Paul wrote, "The Greeks desire wisdom." They wanted to be able to understand the world in their own terms, according to their wisdom. The Greeks were into wisdom, their wisdom. They were a culture known for their philosophers and sages. But their philosophers were looking for wisdom based on their insight and their views of life. When it came to God, they couldn't explain Him or understand Him on their terms. They weren't going to be happy. God had to fit in the box they had built for Him. A college student once told a Christian professor, "For me to believe in God, I have to have a God that I can understand." The professor smiled and replied, "God refuses to be that small." God refuses to be small enough for us to understand in our own terms. In fact, we couldn't understand Him in that way if we wanted to. In Isaiah 55, 8 through 9, God declares, "My thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways ways my ways, declares the Lord. As the heavens are higher than the earth, so are my ways higher than your ways, and my thoughts than your thoughts. God doesn't fit in a neat little box. He is not easily understood. He's difficult, more different than we are. He thinks differently than we do. And he acts differently than we do. And that's why it is so important to read and study the Bible. It tells us all we need to know about who God is and what he likes. It tells us of a God we wouldn't have guessed existed. One of the major characteristics of God is found in the cross. Isaiah 59:15 through 17 describes it this way. The Lord looked and was displeased that there was no justice. He saw that there was no one. He was appalled that there was no one to intervene. So his own arms worked salvation for him, and his own righteousness sustained him. He put on righteousness as his breastplate, and the helmet of salvation on his head. He put the garment of vengeance and wrapped himself in zeal as a cloak. There was no one else to intercede on our behalf. So God clothed himself with righteousness and came down to intervene on our behalf. But the Greeks could not understand that. They could not understand a God who would sacrifice himself for them. Back when I was in school, I loved to read the stories of Greek and later Roman gods. They were very intriguing stories, a multitude of deities the Greeks worshipped. It was called the Pantheon. But none of their gods were like the God of Scriptures. There was Zeus, Poseidon, Aphrodite, and numerous other gods and demigods. But their stories describe them as being egotistical, selfish, bickering, petty, vindictive, adulterous, and heartless. And those were their good traits. What's baffling is that Greeks actually worshipped these gods. They made sacrifices to these petty, mean-spirited gods. But why would the Greeks portray their gods as being so selfish and evil beings? Well, because these were the kind of lifestyles that the Greeks identified with. These were the kind of behaviors that they could understand. Because this was how the average Greek viewed life itself. It's how they lived their lives. The Greeks could not understand a God who would sacrifice himself for them, because they wouldn't be willing to do that for others. The cross declares a God that could not understand in their own wisdom. However, I have a God who is real. Not a God that I've cooked up in my mind, in my imagination. Not a God that is the result of my own personal wisdom. My God is real. My God stepped down out of heaven and took my place on the cross. My God loved me so much that he gave his only begotten Son, that since I believe in him, I will not perish, but have everlasting life. And if I have a God who is willing to do that, what else would he do for me? My God isn't based on my wisdom and my insight of life. My God is based on reality, and so is my attitude. So first, the world looks for an answer that will give them control of their lives. Secondly, the world looks for an answer that allows them to be wise on their own terms. And third, the world is looking for an answer that will give them strength on their terms. 1 Corinthians 1:25 says, God's weakness is stronger than human strength. Many in this world want to be strong. If they tell you a story about themselves, they come across as the hero of that story. Folks don't like to come across as being weak. They don't like being shown as having failed. They don't like hearing that they have messed up. They know they have messed up. They just don't like hearing it. And so they tend to reject the message of the cross because it describes them as having sinned. Billy Joel, for example, was very offended by the message of the cross. I view the whole business as a lot of very enthralling hocus pocus. There's a guy nailed to a cross and dripping blood, and everyone blaming themselves for that man's torment. But I said to myself, forget it. I had no hand in that evil. I had no original sin. There's no blood of any sacred martyr on my hands. I pass on all of this. Joel did not like the idea that his personal sins put Jesus on the cross. That would mean that he was guilty of sin, that he was weak, that he had failed. He didn't want to hear that. But the message, the cross, isn't so much that Billy Joel killed Jesus by his sins. The message of the cross is that Billy Joel deserved to die on the cross of his own sins. And Jesus simply offered to take his place. Jesus came to die for those who had failed, for the weak and broken, and the losers of life. And that's why the message of the cross is so powerful for people like that. Jesus didn't come for the healthy. He came for the sick. One person has observed that anybody could come up with a religion whereby those who deserve to get into heaven might do so. But at the cross, God promised that those who did not deserve heaven could receive it. All the other religions in the world are designed to assure righteous and deserving, that by their own strength and goodness can buy their way into heaven. But the cross declares that not only does no one deserve heaven, the only way you can get into paradise is by accepting the sacrifice of Christ. You have to admit that you are weak and undeserving and need God's help. The world views that reliance on strength. They want power, not weakness. But the cross is all about power. Not ours, but God's. 1 Corinthians 1:18 says, the message of the cross to us who are being saved is the power of God. The cross supplies power the world does not want to accept. It supplies the answers the world cannot provide. And we have got to understand that. The cross is our answer to this world, because it is only through the cross that our lives can be changed. That the power of God unto salvation, and that is the answer the world really needs to hear. May you grow in the grace and knowledge of our Lord and Savior, Jesus Christ.